Welcome back to Soft Chapters, where the quietest person in the room is almost always the one to watch. Pour something warm, settle in, and let this story find you. The auction hall went silent when the cleaning woman raised her hand. She was not supposed to be in that room. Gray uniform, gray card, a rag still hanging from her apron pocket. She had come in to empty the bins between lots, the way she had every Thursday for 2 years, invisible as the carpet. But the item on the pedestal had stopped her cold, and before she understood what her own body was doing, her hand had gone up. 200 people turned to stare. At the front, behind a glass of dark wine and a watch worth more than the building, a man who had not lost anything in 11 years felt the floor shift under him. Because he recognized the woman, and she was supposed to be dead. Rain had been falling on the financial district all afternoon, the slow gray kind that makes the marble lobbies of the Vesper auction house glow like the inside of a pearl. Marisol Vega pushed her cart down the service corridor at 6:30, the way she did every Thursday, her sensible shoes silent on the polished stone. She was 59 years old. Her hands had grown rough from 30 years of other people's floors, other people's messes, other people's lives lived loudly above her while she moved through the quiet edges of them. She wore a gray uniform because the agency required it, and a wedding ring on a chain around her neck because she could not bear to take it off, though the man it belonged to had been gone a long time. Nobody at the Vesper looked at her twice. The wealthy patrons who filled the auction floor on Thursday evenings stepped around her cart without seeing it, the way you step around furniture. That suited Marisol. She had spent 11 years learning to be furniture. That was, she had come to understand, the safest thing a woman in her position could be. The Vesper was not an ordinary place. Its Thursday evening sales moved paintings and jewels and antiquities between the kind of people who never carried cash and never raised their voices. Tonight's catalog held a single headline lot, a small carved music box of black lacquer and mother of pearl, listed simply as provenance uncertain, early European, one of a kind. Marisol had emptied the bin nearest the pedestal 100 times without ever glancing at what stood on it. Tonight she glanced, and the world she had buried came climbing up out of the floor to meet her. She did not gasp. She had trained herself, across 11 years, out of the habit of gasping. She set down the bin she was holding and stood for one heartbeat with her hand pressed flat against the ring beneath her uniform, counting her own breath. Because she knew that music box. She had watched a man carve the last curl of that mother-of-pearl inlay by the light of a single lamp. She had heard the tune it played 10,000 times, humming it to a child who could not sleep. That box had gone into the ground, she had believed, with everything else the night the fire took her house, and her husband, and the life she used to have. It had not gone into the ground. Someone had it. Someone had put it up for sale. And there was only one man alive who could have taken it from the ashes of that house. At the front of the hall, in the first row, that man raised his glass of dark wine to the auctioneer and prepared to buy back the one piece of evidence that could ruin him. His name was Rennick Salt. He was 51, silver at the temples, wrapped in a charcoal suit that cost more than Marisol earned in a year. He owned 9 buildings in this city and a great deal of the men who ran them. 11 years ago he had owned something else, a partnership, a set of accounts, and a business associate named Tomas Vega who had discovered exactly where the money came from and had made the fatal mistake of saying so out loud. Tomas Vega had died in a house fire that the reports called an accident. His wife had vanished the same night, presumed lost, never found. Rennick Salt had spent 11 years believing the last loose thread of the worst thing he had ever done had burned away to nothing. Then a cleaning woman raised her hand in his auction house. The auctioneer had opened bidding at 40,000. A collector in the third row had gone to 55. Rennick had lifted one finger, bored, and the room had understood the lot was his. And then, from the back, a gray uniformed arm rose into the air. 60,000. The auctioneer said automatically, and then faltered, because the bidder was holding a rag. 200 heads turned. Marisol Vega stood very still with her hand in the air and looked, for the first time in 11 years, directly at the man who had killed her husband. Rennick Salt turned in his seat. His face did the thing a face does when it sees something that cannot be there, a small collapse, quickly caught, smoothed over. His wine glass came down onto the arm of his chair with a click that carried in the silence. "Get her out," he said, not loudly. He never said anything loudly. Two men in dark suits detached themselves from the walls. They had been standing there all evening, unremarked, the way Marisol had. They moved toward her cart. Nobody in that room knew they were witnessing anything but an embarrassing mistake. A confused old woman. A cleaning lady who'd wandered where she shouldn't. The patrons murmured and looked away, already bored, already forgetting her. That was the thing about being invisible. It cut both ways. "I withdraw my bid," Marisol said. Her voice did not shake. That was what stopped the two men in their tracks. Not the words, but the steadiness underneath them. The sound of a woman who had already survived the worst thing that could happen to her, and had found the men in this room considerably less frightening than the fire. "I only wanted to be certain of what I was looking at. And now I am." She turned her cart. She did not run. She wheeled it, unhurried, back toward the service corridor, an old woman in gray whom the wealthy patrons had already stopped seeing. Rennick Salt watched her go, and beneath the calm of his face something was working very fast. Because here was his problem. He could not have her taken in front of 200 witnesses, even witnesses who weren't looking. But he could not let her leave the building either. Not now. Not knowing what she knew. He rose, set down his glass, and murmured to the man beside him. "The service level. Quietly. Before she reaches the street." The service corridor of the Vesper ran cold and narrow beneath the glittering hall, all bare pipe, and buzzing light, and the smell of bleach and old dust. Marisol pushed her cart along it at the same even pace, past the freight elevator, toward the loading door that opened onto the alley and the rain. She had almost reached it when the two men stepped out of the stairwell ahead of her and blocked the way. "Ma'am." The larger one had a pleasant voice, the kind trained to sound pleasant. "Mr. Salt would like a word. Just a word. Then you can go home." Marisol stopped her cart. She looked at the two men filling the corridor. She looked at the loading door 6 feet behind them, and the rain beyond it, and she understood with perfect clarity that she was not meant to reach that door alive. For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Rennick Salt himself came down the stairwell behind his men, straightening his cuffs, and the corridor felt suddenly very small. "Marisol," he said, and her name in his mouth was obscene. "You've aged. I almost didn't know you." He tilted his head. "I stood at what was left of that house. I stood there myself, to be sure. There was nothing to find." "There was a cellar," Marisol said quietly. "Tomas built it himself, the winter Lucia was born. It ran under the garden. You never knew it was there because he never told you. He stopped telling you things the day he understood what you were." She held his eyes. "I was in that cellar when the roof came down. I heard your men leave. I climbed out through the garden hatch at dawn, and I walked, and I have been walking ever since." Rennick Salt's jaw tightened. "And you came here, to scrub my floors. For 2 years." A cold amusement moved over his face. "Why, Marisol? Revenge? You're a cleaning woman with a rag. What did you think you were going to do?" "I wasn't looking for revenge," she said. "I was looking for proof." Something in the way she said it made him go still. "You see," Marisol went on, and her voice had changed now, dropped into a register none of them had heard. "The fire took my husband. It took my home. But it did not take what my husband was. Tomas was an accountant, Mr. Salt. A careful, quiet, patient man. He did not fight with fists. He fought with paper. And the night before he died, he was frightened enough to give his wife something to hold." She reached beneath her collar, past the ring, and drew out a slim black object the length of her palm. "A copy of everything. Every account, every routing, every name you paid, and every name you buried. I have carried it against my heart for 11 years, waiting for the one thing I did not have." "And what," Rennick said, very softly, "is that?" "You." Marisol's eyes did not leave his face. "In a room. Admitting, out loud, that you stood at my house and made sure there was nothing to find." She let that settle. "There are 4 cameras in this corridor, Mr. Salt. Your own cameras. You had them installed to watch your staff." The corner of her mouth moved. "You just confessed on all 4 of them." The larger of the two men reached inside his jacket. He never finished the motion. The loading door behind them slammed open, and the alley filled with light and shape and the flat, hard voices of people who identify themselves before they move. Marisol had not come to the Vesper alone. She had come the way Tomas would have, with everything prepared, every angle covered, the trap built quietly over 2 years of emptying bins that no one watched her empty. "Marisol Vega," Rennick Salt breathed. staring at her as though the walls themselves had spoken. "Who are you?" "I'm the woman nobody looked at," she said. "I'm the loose thread you thought had burned." She tucked the black device back beneath her collar, beside the ring, and stepped aside to let them take him. "You should have looked twice." They led Rennick Salt out through the loading door and into the rain, past the freight elevator and the buzzing lights. And not one of the 200 patrons upstairs ever knew that the most important thing to happen at the Vesper that Thursday had happened in the gray corridor beneath their feet, wheeled into place by a cleaning woman with a rag in her apron. By morning, the 9 buildings had new owners in escrow, and the accounts Tomas Vega had died to expose were open on a federal desk. By nightfall, the name Salt moved through the financial district like a cold front, and the men who had stood against the walls learned exactly whom they had failed to see. But the woman who brought it down was already gone, home to a small apartment, to a daughter grown up under a different name, to a music box that a court would one day return to her. She carried up the stairs the one truth she had learned across 11 years and 2 lives and 30 years of other people's floors. They never watched the person holding the rag. Thank you for spending this hour with us here at Soft Chapters. If Marisol's long patience moved you, tell us in the comments about a time you were underestimated and what you did with it. Tap that like, share your idea for the next story below, and subscribe with the bell on so the next chapter finds you the moment it opens.